After recording those videos, I watched them several times and I wanted to add to them. I mispronounced some words, and I won't worry about that because I think you'll understand them. But I also introduced John Brinsmead without giving the background of where he fitted in, and although in the end it came out clear, it would have been a bit confusing. People would have said, what's John Brinsmead got to do with it? But I hope if you watched it through that you did follow that. When I wrote my article called 3 Strikes and You're Out for Good News magazine some years ago, I think about 2007, I thought nobody has written up the history of who sent out the tapes of the October 1979 videos that Des took at PUC. Now, a lot of them did go out. It turned out not to be Robert Brinsmead and sent them out. He said he didn't. Norman Jarness and Jack Zweimer also said that he didn't, and some wouldn't believe him, but I do. And it turned out that Don Croxton, who was an acquaintance of ours in New Mexico, sent them out. But he had died by the time I asked. His son, a psychiatrist in California, wrote to his mother and said, "You did send those tapes out." The week before, I contacted them. His mother had thrown out all the records way back to the beginning of their marriage, just a week before. So she didn't actually remember, but thought they would not have sent out more than 1,000 tapes. Originally, Dean Jennings sent out about 7 tapes, he told me. Dr. Young was one of these people, but Dean said he was very, very careful about it. And what happened was people got those original tapes, mostly the ones sent out by Don Croxton, because when you look in college libraries for those tapes, they usually come from a ministry in New Mexico. Anyway, I had friends that helped me find out what had happened, and I know that people got hold of those tapes in Australia. Rob Thompson was one of them, but there were others, and they sent out many, many tapes. So that was how the tapes got around. And I believe that John Brinsmead came up with this idea that Des sent out, Bob and Des colluded to send out these tapes, and the number given to Des in the Friday afternoon meeting, which wasn't recorded anywhere, but that's what Des remembers, was 50,000 tapes. And Neil Wilson gave this figure as though it was a fact. And for 27 years, even we believe that 50,000 tapes were sent out by Bob Brinsmead. And I decided, while everybody was still alive, to find out. And I went to a great deal of trouble to do this, and it turned out that it was quite fabricated. It wasn't true at all. And as I mentioned, I think that John Brinsmead told Keith Parmenter, who told Neil Wilson, and they took it as fact for whatever reason. They already thought that I was a bad apple, which I've explained in earlier tapes. I couldn't understand it because nobody ever talked to me about it. I might have been a bad apple. Des fortunately likes apples and he thinks I'm a good apple. But anyway, that gives you the background of that. I thought when I wrote that article and wrote about the Friday afternoon, I was absent part of the time, and according to what I'm going to read to you, I was absent for quite a while, but I was there when they talked about Bob Brinsmead and the 4 requirements that Des must follow in order to stay in the church. I don't think I was away for 2 hours, but anyway, that's what they say. They may know better than me. Now, when I wrote up the Friday afternoon, I used the script and I didn't say that I did this, but I thought to be as fair as I could to the brethren, I used their script. And I got hold of notes of that Friday afternoon meeting. There were handwritten notes from Bob Spangler, and there were also typed notes from other people who were there, as you will see, and these were typed out. So handwritten notes, typewritten notes. I typed, this is what you do as a historian, I typed up all the handwritten notes of Spangler. I couldn't read every word, but most of them I got. And so I'm going to read to you some of what they said to Des. Now, the meeting, you'll notice Des responded to some of the things that were said. I must have asked him questions, and I'm also going to tell you that. And the meeting was 3 hours. The notes were summary notes. I can remember things that happened in that meeting that weren't in these notes. Now, you'd have to be pretty serious to listen to all this, but there are people like me who are historians who really want to know the details. And you'll get a picture of what the administration thought of Des. And one of the reasons for doing this is because I'm so favourable to Des. He's my hero. I thought he was wonderful when I first met him. I feel more highly about him. He was pretty frank whenever he got in front of the leaders, and they thought that was what he was like out in the field, but really Des had a great sense of pastoral care. But he thought they should be responsible, and so he spoke to them fairly directly. And you'll see this reflected in what they said about him. So here we go. These notes were used to, as far as I understand, to write up the ministry magazine. I had written to a friend and I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if that Friday afternoon meeting was recorded? And he said, well, actually there are records that are written and typed, and because Bob Spangler had died tragically in a car accident, and because he wasn't a GC president, I was able to get hold of them, but I've never said this now. The person who gave them to me is retired. I think I've been responsible. When I've written, I've used their words largely. Though there are some things in here that I've written about that I remember. And you just have to make a decision for yourself of the right and wrong of it. Notes on meeting with Dr. Desmond Ford, and this is the last day, the last afternoon of the Friday. It was on Friday at Glacier View. And after that, on Saturday, there was a sermon by Duncan Eva who spoke on compassion, and I think we all left on Sunday. So this wasn't the end of it, but this was where they met. And after this meeting, I went out and told, Fred Veltman asked me when I went out what had happened. I said, well, they fired Des. And Pastor Parmenter called me aside later, in trouble again, saying it wasn't true, and it had to go through a number of committees, but it sure seemed to me that Des was fired because he was told he would get his airfare, the family back home, and a year's wages. And afterwards, Elder Parmenter came up, sort of jokingly said, well, I'd offer you a job in the SHF, but I know it wouldn't suit you. So I ask you, did they fire him? Technically not, but it was all over. And my big point is that the consensus statement that was it was a consensus, the agreed work that all the scholars and all the administrators had done through the week. A great deal of work went into that. It wasn't mentioned in the Friday afternoon. Des really was the only person, and you'll see this in the notes. So you can get the notes for yourself. They should be available from GC archives, and people are really interested will want to do it. But anyway, here I am, I'm reading it to you. Introduction. At 4 p.m. on Friday, August the 15th, at Glacier View Camp, a group of 9 men met with Desmond Ford. So now we know who was president. Neil Wilson, president of the General Conference, chaired the meeting. Others present were Ralph Thompson, General Conference Secretary, Francis Wernick, General Vice President, C.E. Bradford, Vice President, President of the North American Division, Keith Parmenter, President of Australasian Division, Charles Hirsch, General Conference Education Department Director, A.N. Duffy, Australasian Ministerial Association Secretary, Duncan Eva, Retired Vice President, and on special assignment for the President, J.R. Spangler, Secretary of the Ministerial Association. This report is a reconstruction of what took place during a 3.5-hour meeting with Desmond Ford. It's based on notes taken by J.R. Spangler and Charles Hirsch. The other members of the committee submitted in written form to J.R. Spangler their recollection of their particular part in the meeting. The meeting was held in the 3rd floor assembly room of the Glacier View Lodge. Gillian Ford came with her husband to the meeting, stayed only several minutes and left. The group discussed the high altitude and pulses were taken of various individuals. Spangler timed various individuals, and Des's pulse at the time was 64. At this point, Des informed the chairman that his wife felt she could not stay at the meeting. The chairman then said that we should get started, as he thought she was returning. Mrs. Ford returned to the meeting about an hour prior to its conclusion. So there you are. I thought I was there longer, but... Meeting reconstruction. President Wilson made a few remarks stating how badly he felt over having a meeting of this type. He spoke very kindly. He stated we cannot go along with some of the doctrinal points that Desmond had made. He mentioned the Sabbath, which was soon to begin. He expressed the hope that we could reflect over the Sabbath and that this day of rest would be a real day of reflection, and hopefully some conclusions could be made by Ford which would be helpful to the church. Then Brother Wilson mentioned to Ford that he recognised it was difficult to expect spontaneous answers to the question that would be asked, but perhaps in spite of this difficulty he would be able to formulate answers to some of the questions that would be asked in order that his position could be made clear. The President continued by stating that we have a responsibility as administrators to make decisions which would bring about a spirit of unity and confidence throughout the rank and file of the church membership. The church at this point in some areas is in an unsettled situation. Since we are accountable to our people, we must have some clear-cut answers in order to make an intelligent decision. At that point, Brother Wilson asked Charles Hirsch to offer prayer. Brother Hirsch offered a very earnest prayer that God would lead in this committee meeting, that any decisions arrived would be at harmony with his will. Following the prayer, the chairman outlined 3 major points on which he wished to speak. These 3 points were attitude, judgment, theology. Under number 1, the chairman, in directing his remarks to Dr. Ford, said in essence, "Your attitude is such that most people think you are totally unyielding and contentious. Your attitude and respect towards the things that you have written and put together is of such a nature that you cannot change and you cannot be wrong. You say you want to listen but you never yield on any point. It comes across to some of us as we've carefully watched you that it's quite impossible for you to be wrong. This is the impression that many of us get. It appears that you are always the teacher. You cannot learn from anyone else. You are the final authority. This aggravates the problem, makes it extremely difficult for us to deal with you and to understand you. The only way we create a team and get along is to be flexible. I'm not referring to being flexible in basic doctrines such as salvation. Your attitude has caused many to be hostile toward the church. The way you approach things, the attitude you convey is to cause the people to say, we've got a crusader here. Maybe he's right and leadership is wrong. You have a charisma, a disarming way to rally people around you, and you can lead people in such a way that they will follow you regardless of whether you were right or wrong. It is a bit similar to the experience that took place in Inter-America some time ago. He was referring to Jim Jones and the Jonestown massacre. You may not believe it, but I must share with you that your influence on young people is to cause them to think that you are the one person who can lead the church out of its theological morass. The chairman expanded more on this particular point, but I feel the above gives a fair representation of what he said. Coming to the second point, that of judgment, the chairman stated, you have many gifts, photographic mind, good speech, brilliant in terms of thinking, and the ability to give a quick response. You are a very able communicator. Then the father spoke of his father, N.C. Wilson, who was president of the Michigan Conference when Ford was taking his graduate work at the University of Michigan. He related how his father told him about one of Ford's professors, stating that Ford had one of the most brilliant minds that they'd ever seen. The chairman continued, yet you lack judgment. As an illustration of this, the chairman mentioned the October 27 meeting with the tape being circulated by Bob Brinsmead on a worldwide basis. They didn't mention in here, as an aside, the 50,000 tapes, but that's what we remember. Then the chairman said, I suggest to you that you could give reassurance to the church as to your position and relationship to Brinsmead if you would protest the circulation of that tape. But you had very little desire to do anything about it. You told me it made no difference. In fact, you refused by saying, well, it might be the best way to circulate truth. But to my mind, this is the very poorest judgment, to think that you would not cooperate on this. I would have done anything in the world to dissociate myself from Brinsmead had I been in your place. You could have been more help to the church. You could have helped keep people from reacting towards the church, but the problem is you will make statements and set things in motion and step back and say, there's nothing I can do about it. As a result of this, you've brought a crisis, not in the church, but in a number of lives. Your attitude needs to be different. We all need to learn to cooperate, and good judgment must be exercised. The chairman then came to the third point on doctrine. The chairman gave the background to his selection of a small committee of 6 individuals to go through Dr. Ford's document and pick out a few salient points which were where disagreement was evident. He stated the document was not duplicated or given out in general. It was read to the group at the end of the Friday morning meeting. Dr. Ford was not present during this reading. It is for this reason that the chairman described the committee, the document, and the purpose of it. Then he stated, "We wanted to be sure that we were fair to you, and for this reason we did not give a copy out, as we wanted to see you first." The 10 points in this document were arrived at from your larger document. Furthermore, this document was shared with our screening committee, which went through it thoroughly. You will notice that there are certain areas of belief which have been taken from your document which are incompatible with our fundamental beliefs. We trust that after hearing this document that you will admit your position is tentative. These 9 pages are areas that you will have to make clear where you stand. After all, you've become a very controversial person, and we believe it's your duty to diffuse this document by making a definitive statement as to your position relative to this document, which we want to share with you. At this point, the chairman asked Spangler to give a copy of the document to Ford, which he did. I believe I was back there by then, or came while that was being read. Then the chairman suggested that Spangler read it before the entire group. At this point, Des said, "Brother Chairman, if it is all right, I can save this committee time if you will just give me 5 minutes, and I will read it through and perhaps understand it even better if I read it myself." The committee waited quietly while Ford read through the 10-point document. After he finished reading it, he stated it was a fair presentation and representation of his position, with the exception of 1 point, and that was point number 4, which is related to the year-day principle. Ford stated that he believed the year-day principle was in a providential way, God helped the Advent movement to establish its existence, but one about which we cannot be dogmatic. Then he repeated, "I find no major fault, and I look on this document as a very fair and representative statement of my position." Coming back to the year-day principle point, Ford said we cannot be dogmatic on dates. He hoped the church would revise its position in this particular area. At this point, Thomas or Wilson asked Des to write out his position on the year-day principle, which Ford did and handed over to Spangler. It read as follows: "As indicated by my Daniel commentary and my sanctuary manuscript, I do believe in the use of the year-day principle in Daniel 7 and 8, in harmony with God's providential arrangement subsequent to the delay of the parousia. But 1, the year-day principle was not God's original intent for these prophecies in this ideal fulfillment, and 2, when now applied, it should not be with punctiliar precision. Thus the beginning and the end dates for the 1260 years and the 2,300 days are flexible." See the Des's Daniel, published by Southern Publishing, on these prophecies of Daniel 7 and 8. Now, they've said a lot about Des, and Des being arrogant, thinking he was right. I've lived with Des for 46 years, and of course I'm biased, but I don't find him that way at all. I found him wonderful with his enemies, but all Des wanted was to deal with the evidence, and, well, anyway, you can see how they were more interested in how Des differed from the 10-point statement, which was between Des and the traditional viewpoint. And they did not use the consensus statement because, whether that was intentional or not, or whether they didn't see it, the consensus statements had advanced on doctrine more than we ever had since Ellen White's time, but that was not taken into account. Now, I brought it up, but nobody else did. All the opposition from traditional Adventists and other ministers who said these things about Des, but you have to ask the question, were they really true? You know, you have to make that decision, and I think that Dr. Young thinks that Des was responsible for something at Glacier View. I'm not sure what. But anyway, it certainly made life difficult for many scholars. Bill Johnson was upset with the way Des did things, and it put people who had any sort of advanced thinking in the line of fire. And I know that Bill had a terrible time at the review because he had to deal with the fallout there, and Norman had a terrible time when he got back home. Athol Tolhurst would have loved to have gotten rid of Norman, but Norman was very smart and able to beat them at their own game, and jolly good for him. So anyway, I hope that in telling you what the brethren said to Des and what they thought about his behaviour gives you a background that they weren't terrible, and some of it may not have been intentional, although it's hard for me to see that there wasn't a plan and set before Des came to get him out. And they did. Anyway, this is section 6A of the meeting. Sometime during this conversation, Ford expressed disagreement with point number 1 of the 10-point statement, which dealt with his methodology. Of course, this was understandable to the group, and it questioned his use of sources and pointed out that he pulled quotations out of context. Spangler said, in the 3 meetings we had with you in the smaller committee, we pointed out some of these discrepancies and your use of sources and pulling them out of context. Ford, there are only several critiques of my paper by the guidance committee. This was before Glacier View, in the months before Glacier View. There are only several critiques of my paper by the guidance committee, and about the only one of any consequence was that written by Gerhard Damsteed. However, in the replies that you received, it was pointed out you took certain statements out of context. You made no changes whatsoever in your final document. Wilson said, I want to express appreciation to you for your reaction to this 10-point statement. We've tried to be fair and objective in pointing out our differences, and the fact that you state that this paper is a fair representation of your position naturally pleases us. There is another area of great consternation to us, and that is your relationship to Brinsmead. We are disturbed over your apparent willingness to tell us wherein you disagree with Brinsmead. You simply state that you agree with him where he's right, you disagree where he's wrong. Parmenter said, I wish, as a personal friend, that I didn't have to be involved in such a meeting. However, you recognised it's my responsibility, Des. You failed to accept our counsel. Even though I've defended your integrity and good name over many years. But you have not helped us. Your ministry has been appreciated, especially in the area of the gospel, though you know I've counseled you not to be too extreme in the area of justification. You have not responded to our many requests to show where you differ from Robert Brinsmead. The result of your ministry has been to bring division and tension in the church. Most of the scholars with whom I've talked do not agree with your doctrinal positions. Well, I talked to many, Des was off with other people, I talked to many of the scholars, and I really question that. In Brinsmead's book, 1844, Re-Examined, some believe you helped him in this. This would be John Brinsmead again, this is an aside. I think Des saw it when it was published. When I asked Bob, he said no, Des had nothing to do with that book. We cannot go on in doubt. Some strongly declare you are behind this. Brinsmead's newest manuscript, which probably is being published this month, Judged by the Gospel, a review of Adventism, is one in which we find the church being attacked again. Leadership is discredited. Brinsmead is urging a congregational type of structure. It has been said by several sources that his attack on the church is in conjunction with the attack that you are now making, and that your next move is to attempt to get churches to be on their own. Why have you never been willing to identify where you stand and dissociate yourself from Brinsmead? Your views either are so close to his or you are in collusion. Questions are asked, is Des in harmony with RDB? Both are teaching the same thing. And it looks like you endorse each other. Where do you differ? Brinsmead has declared war on the church, and of course this makes it appear that you too are warring on the church. At this point, Parmenter showed a Brinsmead document which was passed out in the churches in Australia. It was a document dealing with the comparisons of the traditional stand and the new theology. Many of the points were quite similar to those in Ford's document, but Ford stated as he looked at his, he did not agree with several points and mentioned them specifically. Ford admitted he had the latest copy of Bob Brinsmead's book, which is to be published soon, but he declared that there was no collusion between them. He further stated that he could not oppose Brinsmead on his emphasis on righteousness by faith, especially justification. And now that Brinsmead has changed, he is in harmony with him on this point, but that he is not in harmony with Brinsmead on his methodology. Now, you have to remember that Des wrote in the Signs of the Times and answered question and answers for 30 years in Australia. I think it was the Signs of the Times. And he was sort of the Bible answer man for the Australasian division. And Bob had, he dealt with Bob when he was a perfectionist. And to a lot of people in this Friday afternoon meeting, they wouldn't even have talked to Bob Brinsmead. Wouldn't be politically correct. But this had been Des's work. And he rejoiced that Bob switched over and started teaching the gospel of justification by faith, which Des had learned from Spurgeon, but also from Heppenstall. So, anyway, that's a little sideline. You can see the brethren's problem. I can see it, but there was a lot of slagging Des. We experienced at PUC, and I told you how Dr. Ford's dangerous doctrines went round many of the churches where Des spoke. And this was never taken into account, that there was another side, that Des had been targeted. Never came up, except when I brought it up. Charles E. Bradford referred to his experience with Robert and John Brinsmead in the early 70s. He gave a bit of the history relative to R.H. Pearson and the General Conference officers setting up a committee to study with Bob and John Brinsmead and Dr. Jack Swamer. He spoke of a particular meeting where he saw Bob Brinsmead write a new formula for the gospel on the blackboard. They refused, however, to submit to church authority in the Council of the Brethren. It was then that I sensed that their problem was to be one of spirit rather than altogether theological, said Bradford. In referring to the present meeting, Bradford said he had a queasy feeling, a feeling of déjà vu, the illusion that one has previously had an experience that is actually new to one. Bradford's appeal to Des was that he not follow in Brinsmead's footsteps. Next, Bradford challenged Des Sweetman's statements that nobody is preaching the sanctuary doctrine. You give the feeling that no one else knows it but you. You act as though you know it all. Here is this entire conference. The majority believe your position is wrong, and yet you will not change. Well, a lot of them that we talked to did believe it, but some of them didn't say anything. I don't know what to say about that, except that you can go and read the documents, read the consensus statements, compare them with traditional Adventism, and so on. Reference was then made to Bradford's father's experience. His father stood firm. Even though he was shabbily treated by the brethren, he refused to go off with the Humphrey movement. We don't know what the Humphrey movement is. At this point, Wilson qualified who Humphrey was and his departure from the church. Bradford continued his remarks, stating that Brinsmead showed no remorse over the scores of laymen and workers he led astray, some to complete shipwreck of faith. Brinsmead felt that the Lord was using him to stir up the church. Bradford referred to Jesus' words about offending one of these little ones and the terrible threat of punishment. He then confronted Ford with a strong appeal to think about this matter. Bradford stated, "The devil wants to have you and to sift you as wheat." In Bradford's statements, he mentioned that Ford's material had been stimulating. He mentioned using Ford's book on Daniel published by Southern Pub. Yet some have lost out because of his teaching. He asked, "Do you really love your brethren in the ministry?" At this point, I believe, this is Spangler speaking, Francis Wernick spoke, and his comments are attached. Des, I've learnt to have a high regard for you even though I haven't known you as well as some of the others here. Now that you reviewed the 10 points of difference between your views and the views of the church, as the committee here has seen them, is it fair to say that these positions attributed to you represent what you believe? And is it fair to say you disbelieve the positions of the church? The view, Desmond. The view attributed to me in this paper are what I believe, until the brethren come up with evidence that these views are wrong. It is fair to say I do not believe the position of the church in some of these areas. Wernick, then this creates a rather deep gulf between your beliefs and those of the church. Desmond, I would say that this is the case. However, brethren, the statement of beliefs voted by the church at Dallas shows a very definite shift away from Ellen White and the sanctuary area. In the statement about the sanctuary, it says nothing about 2 apartments. This hasn't been in our statement since Fletcher. We now only speak about phases. I could feel very comfortable preaching under the umbrella of the consensus paper. It shows a definite shift away from Ellen White. The church has moved quite away from its past position to where I am. In a few years it will come all the way. Wernick said, if I thought this consensus paper was really a shift away from the spirit of prophecy and our historic positions, I would not have voted for it. Several others commented that they did not think the consensus paper showed such a shift. Des, you have mentioned that when Ellen White said, I saw, she may not have been referring to a vision. But when she read Crozier's article, she said, I was shown in vision that Crozier had the truth about the cleansing of the sanctuary. Don't you see that as confirming our views on the sanctuary? Des, well, there were many things in Crozier's article Ellen White did not accept and considered erroneous. Wernick, but she did see in vision that he had the truth of the cleansing of the sanctuary, but she did not endorse all that he wrote. But she did advise everyone to read the article. Following Wernick's statement, I believe the chairman called on A.N. Duffy to speak, and his comments are as follows. And because I've gone for 40 minutes, I'm going to stop here and start again.